It's strange, isn't it, how quiet a funeral can be, even with so many people around. Daniel never liked silence, but that day, the silence inside the church felt heavier than the coffin itself. The air smelled faintly of lilies and old wood polish. The stained glass above the altar painted fractured colors over the rows of black coats and polite sadness. He watched people he hadn't seen in decades whispering condolences that felt rehearsed. Words like "he lived a good life," and "he's in a better place now." He wanted to believe that, but he couldn't. Michael stood near the casket, tall, composed, every gesture measured. He greeted everyone like a host at a formal dinner, shaking hands, offering soft smiles. "Thank you for coming. Dad would have appreciated it," he said again and again, with a calm that almost looked sincere. Daniel, on the other hand, stood near the back, quiet. He had nothing to say. He looked at their mother, sitting in the front pew, fragile in her black dress, her eyes lost somewhere between the past and the present. When the priest spoke of their father's legacy, a man who built his family from the ground up, Daniel thought about all the nights his father came home angry, the tension, the silence over dinner, the unspoken rivalry between brothers. Legacy. The word stung. After the final prayer, people began to leave one by one, their footsteps echoing off the marble floor. Michael approached Daniel, clapping him on the shoulder with that same practiced warmth. "You holding up okay?" Daniel forced a smile. "I'm fine." "Good," Michael said, glancing toward the casket. "Let's get through the will reading tomorrow. Then we can both start moving forward." Moving forward. Michael always had a way of sounding like the future belonged to him. The next day, the family gathered in their father's old study, the one that smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. The lawyer, an old friend of their father's, sat behind the oak desk with a stack of envelopes neatly arranged. The air felt thick with anticipation. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. What did he leave us? Michael stood behind their mother's chair, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, looking confident. Daniel sat across from them, fingers interlocked, staring at the lawyer's lips as he began to read. "To my sons, Michael and Daniel, and to my beloved wife, Eleanor." The will was short, surprisingly short. Michael inherited the family business, the trucking company their father built over 40 years. Daniel was given the old family house and a small trust fund. Their mother, Eleanor, was to remain under Michael's care, both financially and medically, as long as she lived. Michael's expression didn't change. He nodded like it was exactly what he expected. Daniel felt, not anger but something heavier, confusion, maybe even guilt. He wasn't ambitious like his brother. He'd left the business years ago, after an argument with their father. Maybe this was his punishment. Then the lawyer paused, frowning slightly as if uncertain whether to continue reading the next line. He cleared his throat and said, "There is one final note handwritten by your father." He unfolded the paper carefully. The room fell into absolute stillness. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stop ticking. The lawyer read, "Daniel, my son, don't trust your brother." No one breathed. Eleanor's hands began to tremble slightly. Michael let out a sharp laugh, too loud for the room. "Oh, come on," he said, forcing a grin. "That must have been written during one of his bad days. You all know how dramatic Dad could get." He looked around for agreement, but no one spoke. Daniel felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. He looked at his mother. Her eyes darted between them, full of something he couldn't quite name. Fear? Guilt? Regret? For a brief moment, her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but then she just lowered her gaze and whispered, "Let's go home, boys." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Rain tapped softly against his window. The old house creaked, the way it always did when the wind came from the east. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing his father's voice echo in his mind. That deep, steady tone he hadn't heard in years. "Don't trust your brother." He tried to laugh it off just like Michael did. Maybe it was just an old man's paranoia. The ramblings of someone who'd worked too hard and trusted too little. But somewhere inside, the words rooted themselves like a splinter. At around 3 a.m., Daniel got up, walked to the living room, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He stared at the family portrait on the wall, his father in the middle, Michael on the right, himself on the left. Michael had that same confident grin. Daniel, barely in his 20s back then, looked unsure of himself. Even in the picture, their father's hand rested on Michael's shoulder, not his. He whispered under his breath, "What did you mean, Dad?" The lights flickered slightly, and for a brief second, he swore he heard something. A whisper, faint and hoarse, carried by the wind through the half-open window. "Don't trust him." Daniel turned sharply, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the sound of the rain. He shut the window and stood there for a long time, staring out at the dark, wet street. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he whispered back, "I won't." If you were Daniel, would you ignore the message, or start looking for what your father saw? Weeks passed after the funeral, but the air in the old family home felt heavier than ever. Daniel tried to convince himself that time would heal, that grief would dull the edges of confusion and unease. But something had shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Michael moved through the house with an ease Daniel never could match. He arranged meetings, signed documents, checked accounts, and smiled at their mother as if nothing was wrong, as if control alone could fix grief. Every phone call he made, every letter he opened carried that air of authority. Daniel watched silently, feeling increasingly invisible in the very home he had grown up in. Their mother, Eleanor, began to change. At first it was small things, forgetting where she placed her glasses, leaving the tea kettle on the stove, asking the same question twice in one conversation. Daniel would gently correct her or remind her, and she would smile at him, grateful, but always quickly turn to Michael for reassurance. One morning, Daniel went to the bedroom where his father's old study papers had been left undisturbed. He opened the drawer where he had kept a few personal items, memories from his childhood, a few letters from his father, and the wristwatch he had promised to guard forever. But it wasn't there. The watch was gone. "Maybe Mom gave it away," Michael said casually when Daniel mentioned it, glancing up from a stack of papers he was signing. His tone was almost teasing, but Daniel could feel the edge beneath it, a quiet authority meant to shut down questions. Daniel didn't know whether to feel anger or unease. Something about the casualness, the ease with which Michael dismissed what Daniel considered sacred, felt wrong. The house, once filled with childhood laughter and small arguments, felt colder. The familiar scent of old books, polished wood, and lemon soap now carried a weight that made the rooms feel foreign. As Daniel wandered through the hallways, memories began to surface. Childhood moments that had once seemed insignificant now appeared with startling clarity. Michael lying about breaking the neighbor's window, only for their father to scold Daniel instead. Michael convincing their father to give him more allowance, leaving Daniel with barely enough for school lunches. The time Michael had hidden Daniel's school report card to cover his own mistakes, and their father had never questioned him. Daniel realized something that sent a shiver down his spine. That pattern, Michael manipulating situations, escaping consequence, controlling the narrative, it had never ended. It hadn't stopped with childhood. It had grown with him, evolved, and now he was living under its shadow again. He began to notice the small things that didn't add up. The bills Michael paid seemed higher than Daniel remembered. Some accounts were closed without notice. Personal letters from their father's old business partners went missing, or arrived late. Eleanor would repeat stories to Michael that she had told Daniel only moments before, as if he wasn't even part of the conversation. Daniel felt a quiet tension settle over him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single violent act. It was a creeping, insidious control that Michael exerted over the family, over the house, over the memory of their father. Yet, Daniel hesitated. He questioned himself constantly. Was he imagining it? Was grief making him suspicious? Had he simply been the weaker son, the one always overlooked, the one who could never measure up? But then came small signs that gnawed at him, proof he could not ignore. He overheard Michael on the phone, insisting on a deal with a family friend that Daniel knew their father would never have approved. He noticed bank documents tucked away in Michael's briefcase, altered in ways only someone deeply familiar with their father's handwriting could manage. Even Eleanor, once sharp and careful, would nod obediently to Michael's statements about finances and family plans, as if trusting him was the only safe choice. Daniel began to ask himself questions he hadn't dared before. Not out loud, but in his own mind. Why does he get to decide everything? Why is Mom so afraid to question him? Was Dad right all along? And every time he asked, he could feel the weight of their father's last words pressing down on him. Don't trust your brother. He remembered a quiet afternoon years ago, sitting on the back porch as a child, watching Michael charm the neighbors while Daniel carried out their father's errands. He had laughed then, thinking it was harmless, a brotherly competition. Now he understood that the charm had always been a mask, a tool to manipulate, and it had never failed Michael. The thought made him restless. The quiet calm of the house was broken now, and Daniel could no longer pretend it was simply grief settling in. Something had shifted irreversibly, and he sensed that a reckoning was coming, though he didn't yet know when or how. And in the evenings when Eleanor slept and Michael left the study, Daniel would sit in the old armchair by the fireplace, turning over his father's warning in his mind, asking himself almost aloud, if he was dangerous before, what could he be capable of now? The questions lingered unspoken but persistent, and Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. The calm in the house was an illusion. Beneath it, the cracks had begun to spread, and soon they would widen into something impossible to ignore. The old study smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the same scent it had carried for decades. Daniel ran his fingers along the spines of his father's books, feeling the weight of memory and history in each one. He had spent hours over the past few weeks trying to make sense of the small cracks that had begun to appear in the house, in the family, in Michael. And though he tried to stay busy with chores and paperwork, something about the study drew him back again and again. That evening, as the late sun poured through the half-open blinds, casting long shadows across the floor, Daniel's hand stopped on a particularly worn book, one that his father had always kept on the top shelf. It was leather-bound, cracked at the edges, and the pages smelled faintly of aged paper and ink. As he opened it, something inside fell out, a carefully folded envelope sealed and yellowed with age. His heart skipped a beat. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. His father's familiar, careful script, the one that had always seemed stern yet tender when he wrote it for Daniel, spelled out 3 words that made him swallow hard. If you ever doubt him. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he picked up the envelope. He turned it over, feeling the rough texture of the paper against his fingers. Inside he found 2 items, a letter and a small flash drive. He held the letter first, unfolding it slowly. If you're holding this, something has gone wrong. The truth isn't in what your brother shows you. It's in what he hides. His father's words hit him like a weight pressing on his chest. He read the line again, then again, trying to make sense of it. The truth isn't in what he shows me. It's in what he hides. Daniel felt a surge of both fear and comfort. Fear, because the words implied danger he hadn't fully imagined before. Comfort, because it was his father speaking to him, warning him even after death, protecting him even now. He picked up the flash drive, turning it over in his hand. Something inside told him it held answers, maybe even the proof of the quiet suspicions that had been gnawing at him for weeks. And yet, a part of him resisted. Am I ready to know the truth? He wondered. Would it change everything I thought I knew about my family, about Michael, about Mom? Before he could think further, a voice broke the tense silence of the study. Still playing detective, little brother? Daniel jumped slightly. Michael stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his smile wide but forced. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied Daniel carefully. That smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, made Daniel feel exposed, as if Michael could see right through him. Daniel's stomach knotted. I was just cleaning, he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Michael's gaze shifted to the book on the floor and the envelope in Daniel's hand. He raised an eyebrow. Looks like you found something interesting. Daniel felt the weight of the flash drive pressing against his palm. A secret he wasn't ready to reveal. Just some old papers, he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. Michael smiled again, sharper this time. You know, Danny, curiosity can be dangerous. The words hung in the air like smoke. Michael didn't move closer, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but the tension was thick, almost suffocating. Daniel could feel it in the quiet of the room, in the stillness that seemed to stretch on for an eternity. When Michael finally walked away, the study felt colder, emptier. Daniel's heart pounded. He glanced at the envelope again, then at the flash drive. His father's warning echoed in his mind. The truth isn't in what he shows you. It's in what he hides. Daniel sat down heavily in the old armchair. He wanted to open the flash drive immediately, to confront whatever secrets it held. But he hesitated. The risk felt too great. What if Michael had been hiding something dangerous? What if his father's words weren't just a warning about petty deceit, but something far more serious? He thought of the times he had seen Michael manipulate situations, lie with ease, charm their father, charm neighbors, charm anyone who might notice a mistake. It had always been in the background, almost invisible, until now. Daniel realized the implications. His father had been protecting him, steering him away from something he hadn't fully understood. Hours passed. The sun sank behind the trees and shadows stretched across the study. Daniel's mind was a storm of questions. Why did Dad leave this only for me? What had Michael been hiding all these years? Was Mom aware of it? The more he thought, the heavier the tension grew. He realized he couldn't tell anyone, not yet. If Michael sensed even a hint of suspicion, he would manipulate it, twist it, make Daniel look paranoid. That was Michael's way: to control, to dominate, to win silently. Daniel finally set the letter and flash drive aside on the desk. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the fading light over the old oak tree in the yard. His father's words replayed in his mind. "Don't trust your brother." And then, almost unconsciously, Daniel whispered aloud, "Why, Dad? What was he hiding?" The silence that followed felt oppressive. For a long time, Daniel simply stood there, thinking, remembering, questioning. He thought about the way Michael had always taken the lead, the way Eleanor seemed to rely entirely on Michael, the quiet, subtle control he exercised over every aspect of the family. A question formed in Daniel's mind, unspoken but insistent. How far would Michael go to keep his secrets hidden? Even as he asked himself that, he felt a strange pull. A mixture of fear and responsibility. He had a choice now. He could ignore the warning, live as if nothing had changed, and let Michael's control continue. Or he could seek the truth no matter the cost. And deep down, Daniel knew that he could never go back once he chose. If you found a secret left by a deceased parent, would you risk uncovering it, knowing it could destroy your family? The weeks after discovering the envelope passed in a blur, but Daniel could feel the house changing around him. It wasn't just the shadows of memory that grew longer with the setting sun, or the way the old floorboards creaked differently underfoot. It was something heavier. A quiet weight settling over Eleanor, his mother, and the house itself. When Daniel visited, she no longer looked at him as she once did. Her eyes, once sharp and clear, now flickered with confusion. She hesitated when he asked simple questions, stared at him for a moment as if trying to place him, then returned her gaze to Michael. It wasn't just forgetfulness, it was deference, almost fear, and Daniel felt a chill he couldn't shake. Michael had taken control. He arranged her medications, scheduled appointments, and handled every financial decision. Even small tasks, paying bills, responding to letters, approving minor household repairs, were done under his watchful eye. And Eleanor, usually a woman of remarkable independence, obeyed him without question. Daniel tried to talk to her one afternoon in the sitting room. The sunlight streamed through the windows, dust motes floating lazily in the warm air. He reached out, gently touching her hand. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked softly. Her eyes flicked up at him, wide and searching. And then she whispered, her voice fragile, "Your father tried to stop him, but he couldn't." The words hit Daniel like a hammer. He froze, searching her face for clues. "What do you mean?" he pressed, leaning closer. "Stop who? Stop what?" But Eleanor shook her head, her trembling hands lifting to cover her mouth. She leaned back, avoiding his gaze, her lips pressed together so tightly it was as if speaking would break her. Daniel sat back, a knot forming in his chest. He wanted to press further, to demand answers, but he could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't fear of him, it was something else. Something that had been growing quietly for weeks, maybe months, maybe years. That night, the silence of his room offered no comfort. The words repeated in his mind. "Your father tried to stop him, but he couldn't." Then the phone rang. It was Michael. "Stop confusing Mom with your questions," Michael said sharply, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She's sick. You're making it worse." Daniel's hand tightened around the receiver. "I'm not confusing her. I need to understand. Something's wrong." Michael's laughter was low and cold. "Wrong? Don't make me laugh, Danny. Everything's fine." You're the one making a mess out of nothing. Stop stirring the waters. Mom doesn't need it. And you don't need to interfere." He hung up before Daniel could respond. Daniel sat in the darkened room, staring at the phone, feeling the old tension coil tighter around him. Michael's control wasn't just obvious anymore, it was suffocating. Every action he took regarding their mother, every small decision, was a reminder that Daniel had been powerless in this family for as long as he could remember. That night, Daniel began looking more closely at the documents Michael controlled. He noticed discrepancies, bills that had been paid without explanation, accounts closed or moved, letters from old business contacts that never reached Daniel or Eleanor, property deeds and paperwork that had been signed in Michael's name, supposedly for convenience. The deeper he looked, the more resistance he met. Michael always had an excuse, a calm explanation, a polite dismissal, and Eleanor, unable or unwilling to contradict him, accepted it without question. Daniel couldn't shake the guilt that had been growing for years. Old voices, old criticisms, old family comparisons haunted him. You're too weak. You're too sensitive. You'll never be responsible like Michael. Had he really been the bad son all along? Had his father's frustration with him been justified? Or was this all Michael's doing, this manipulation, this subtle twisting of reality from the beginning? Every visit left Daniel more drained, more tense. Every interaction with his mother left him haunted by the whisper of her words. And every encounter with Michael reminded him that the house, the family, even their mother's life, was no longer his domain. It belonged to Michael. At night, Daniel would sit alone in his father's old study, staring at the envelope and the flash drive. The warning he had found there became louder in his mind with each passing day. The truth isn't in what he shows you. It's in what he hides. And Daniel knew with a deep, gnawing certainty that he could not ignore it any longer. Somewhere beneath the quiet, beneath the calm surface of the house, the cracks had grown. And soon they would widen into something that could no longer be hidden. Have you ever seen a family member slowly take control, and everyone else seems powerless to stop it? The phone rang late that night, shattering the quiet of Daniel's apartment. The sound jolted him awake. It was Michael. "She's gone," Michael said, his tone flat, almost rehearsed, as though he were reading from a script. "Mom went peacefully in her sleep. I've arranged everything. The cremation, the service, it's all taken care of." Daniel felt a strange numbness. He wanted to cry, to scream, to demand answers, yet he found himself frozen, words caught in his throat. She's gone," he finally managed to whisper. "Yes," Michael said, calm and precise. "Everything is as she would have wanted. You don't need to worry about anything." Daniel hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring at the wall. The air in his small apartment felt suffocating. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had been finalized. No consultation, no discussion. Everything had already been decided. By the time he arrived at the funeral home the next morning, Daniel's unease had grown into a quiet dread. Michael greeted him at the door, perfectly composed, smiling in a way that almost seemed normal. Almost. "Thank you for coming," Michael said, his hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. "I've taken care of everything." Daniel followed Michael inside, the weight of the building pressing down on him. Everything was pristine, sterile. A stark contrast to the warmth he remembered in his mother's home. The service had already been arranged, the cremation scheduled, the payments finalized. There was no time to pause, no room to question, no chance to say goodbye properly. Michael led him to the front of the small gathering. The few friends and distant relatives who attended nodded politely, whispered condolences, but their eyes flickered with curiosity, as if they sensed the tension between the brothers. Then Michael handed Daniel the urn. It was small, polished, engraved neatly with Eleanor's name. But something felt off. It was too light, too impersonal. Daniel's fingers lingered on it, almost expecting to feel the familiar weight of his mother's ashes, the reality of her gone presence. He held it gently but said nothing. He couldn't. The pit in his stomach had grown. Something was wrong. Deep down he knew it. The memorial passed in a blur. Michael spoke eloquently about their mother, recounting her virtues, her kindness, the life she had led. Daniel listened silently, noting how perfectly rehearsed Michael's words sounded, how every gesture, every pause, every nod seemed calculated. No one questioned him. No one looked at him as a son who had lost his mother. Michael had managed it all, controlling the story, the narrative, the grief itself. And Daniel felt smaller and smaller with each passing moment. When the guests finally left, Michael pulled Daniel aside. "It's over now," he said. "We did everything she wanted. Don't dwell on it." Daniel nodded, but his mind was racing. Something about the urn, the speed of the cremation, the total control Michael had exercised, none of it felt right. He went home that evening, staring at the urn on the mantel, the engraved letters cold and impersonal. He couldn't sleep. Questions churned relentlessly. Why had Michael acted so quickly? Why had he never asked for Daniel's input? Did Eleanor really agree to all this, or had Michael made the decisions alone? And why did the urn feel so light? Daniel began recalling the warning his father had left. Don't trust your brother. He thought about the subtle ways Michael had controlled their mother in the weeks before her death. The medications, the finances, the appointments. How she had seemed frightened or hesitant around him. How she whispered those strange words to Daniel. Your father tried to stop him, but he couldn't. The pieces started to form a picture that made Daniel's chest tighten. Michael had always been the one in control. And now, with their mother gone, the final piece of the family under his power, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging sense that something darker had occurred. Something Michael didn't want anyone to see. The more he replayed the day, the more details he noticed. The way Michael insisted on speaking for everyone during the memorial. How he had positioned Daniel in the back, almost as if to minimize his presence. The subtle glances he exchanged with the funeral director. The quiet authority he wielded over the staff. Daniel couldn't deny it any longer. He had been excluded, controlled, and dismissed again. That night, he sat with the urn in his lap, staring at the polished surface. The weight of it pressed into his mind far more than it did into his hands. Something was wrong, and he knew it. He could feel it in the tension of the house, in the absence of his mother's voice, in the quiet dominance of his brother. He whispered to himself, almost hoping the words would summon the truth. What did you do, Michael? What did you really do? And in the shadows of the room, the light from the street outside fell across the urn, glinting slightly, as if mocking him. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew one thing. He couldn't trust Michael. Not now. Not ever. And he would find out the truth, no matter what it took. Have you ever felt powerless at a family event? Noticing something wasn't right but unable to prove it? The morning was gray and damp when Daniel finally arrived at the crematorium listed on the paperwork Michael had provided. A thin drizzle slicked the pavement, adding to the heaviness in his chest. He clutched the documents in his hand, each one a small promise of closure that Michael had already claimed to deliver. The receptionist at the counter glanced up at him, polite but professional. How can I help you? Daniel swallowed, steadying his voice. I'm here to confirm a cremation for Eleanor Mason. It should have been done 2 weeks ago. The woman typed something into her computer, frowned and shook her head. I'm sorry, sir. There's no record of that name in our files. No cremation on that date, and no advance paperwork that matches this. Daniel blinked. He handed her the paperwork again, hoping maybe there had been a clerical error. But her expression didn't change. Nope. Nothing here, she said gently. Daniel felt the world tilt. His knees weakened slightly, and he gripped the edge of the counter. No name. No file. No trace. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The carefully controlled narrative Michael had spun, the perfectly scheduled cremation, the polished urn, the seamless memorial, had been a lie. Everything he had been told, every carefully rehearsed word, every display of peaceful closure, was false. He left the crematorium in a fog, the drizzle soaking through his coat as if the weather itself mourned Eleanor's stolen truth. His father's words echoed in his mind, almost a whisper carried by the wind. Don't trust your brother. That evening, back at the house, Daniel sat at the old oak desk in his father's study. His hand lingered over the flash drive. The small metal rectangle that had felt like a burden before now felt like a lifeline. He plugged it into his laptop and stared at the screen. Files began to load. Business records, emails, scanned letters, audio files. A trove of evidence his father had left behind. The first ones he opened were mundane. Ledgers, invoices, reports. But as he scrolled, he noticed discrepancies, subtle at first. Then patterns emerged. Michael had been stealing company funds for years. He had forged signatures, manipulated financial records, and even rewrote contracts in their father's name. Daniel's stomach turned. His father hadn't been paranoid. He had been seeing the truth, the quiet, insidious corruption that Michael had been building beneath their father's watchful eye. He opened a letter, its edges worn with time, handwriting firm but familiar. He read, "He'll destroy this family if no one stops him. If I'm gone, promise me you won't look the other way." The words reverberated in Daniel's chest. Promise me you won't look the other way. His father had known. He had tried to shield Daniel from Michael's manipulation, from the danger, but had trusted him enough to leave a weapon, information, in his hands. Daniel felt anger harden into purpose. The quiet unease that had haunted him for weeks crystallized into something sharper. Michael had taken everything, their mother, control of the family, even the appearance of peace, and spun it into his favor. And Daniel would no longer stand by. He clicked on an audio file next. The low hum of static preceded a recorded conversation. Michael on the phone with a business partner, casually discussing embezzlement, dismissing it as necessary adjustments, speaking with a confidence and ease that made Daniel's blood run cold. Michael had lied, stolen, and manipulated without a shred of conscience. Another file. An old voicemail from one of their father's confidants. "If Michael isn't stopped, he'll take it all. He'll break the company, he'll break the family. Don't let him fool you." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The room felt smaller, the shadows longer, the house heavier. But in the midst of the shock, clarity emerged. He wasn't powerless. He had the truth. The father's warning. The proof of Michael's deceit. And Daniel realized that from this moment on nothing would be the same. He whispered aloud, almost as if to himself, almost as if to his father. "I see it now, Dad. I won't look the other way. I promise." The house felt silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that comes after a storm passes, only to leave an unsettling calm. Daniel's thoughts raced. How far had Michael gone to cover his tracks? What other lies had he spun around their mother, their inheritance, their lives? And how much would it cost Daniel to confront the truth? The questions were heavy, but Daniel felt a strange resolve in them. He was no longer just a son observing, a passive participant in the family drama. He was a guardian of the truth, a bearer of the evidence, and soon he would act. He thought back to the flash drive and the letter, to his father's final warning, and a cold certainty settled in him. Michael's time of hiding was over. Have you ever realized something you were told to trust was completely false? Daniel sat in the dim light of the study, the hum of his laptop filling the silence of the old house. Outside, the night had settled deep, the wind rattling loose branches against the windows. He had pored over every file on the flash drive, but one folder still sat unopened. The label caught his eye. Home Security, March 17th. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the file. A part of him wanted to turn away, to leave some truths buried, to protect what was left of his sanity. But the other part, the part that had been growing in strength, fueled by weeks of suspicion, fear, and his father's warning, demanded he look. He clicked. The video began, grainy but clear enough. It showed the living room of their family home. Their mother, Eleanor, stood near the armchair, her face pale, eyes wide. Michael was there too, his posture tense, his face controlled but sharp. They were arguing. At first, the argument seemed almost banal, voices raised over money, financial decisions, inheritance disputes. But the tone shifted. Words became sharper, accusations cut deeper, and Daniel's stomach twisted as he realized the escalation. "Why can't you understand?" Michael demanded, his voice low, angry but controlled. "I trusted you. I trusted you with everything," Eleanor cried, desperation breaking through her frailty. Daniel watched frozen as Michael advanced. The argument turned physical, not immediately violent but forceful. Eleanor stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. She fell to the floor. For a moment Michael froze, panic flashing across his face, betraying the composed persona he always wore in public. Then, almost mechanically, he bent down and dragged her body out of frame. Daniel's hands shook. His chest felt tight, his heart racing as the pieces snapped together in horrifying clarity. The betrayal wasn't financial. It wasn't a lie he could dispute in court. It was mortal. His mother didn't die peacefully, as Michael had claimed. She died terrified, struggling against the hands of the one person she had been forced to trust. And the urn, the light, polished urn he had held just weeks ago, it had been a lie. There were never any ashes. There had never been peace. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering image on the screen, unable to move. Rage, grief, and disbelief collided within him. He felt the full weight of his father's warning, of the flash drive, of every subtle manipulation, every act of control Michael had exercised over their family. The betrayal was complete. The man he had called brother, the one their mother had trusted to care for her, the one their father had warned him about, had orchestrated the final act of cruelty. Daniel thought of the weeks leading up to this moment. The missing documents, the strange phone calls, the sudden cremation, the empty urn, the rehearsed memorial, the carefully crafted narrative. Every detail, every polished action had been designed to hide the truth. His hands clenched into fists. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "You won't get away with this, Michael. Not now. Not ever." Hours passed as he sat there, replaying the footage, analyzing every detail. He noticed the subtle things. The way Michael's eyes darted nervously when he moved his mother, the hesitation in his voice, the careful positioning of objects in the room to hide evidence. Michael had planned everything meticulously, but in his overconfidence, he had left a trace. Daniel realized the gravity of the situation. He couldn't act rashly, couldn't confront Michael blindly. The truth had to be handled carefully. Evidence had to be preserved. Witnesses, records, proof. Every detail mattered. His father's warning echoed again. Don't trust your brother. But now Daniel understood fully. Trust was gone. Trust had been replaced by a cold, hard purpose. He thought of the audience of his memories, of older listeners who had endured family betrayals, silent manipulations, and quiet injustices. He could almost hear them asking themselves the same questions he now faced. How long had I ignored the signs? Could I have prevented this if I had acted sooner? When someone you trust does the unthinkable, what do you do next? Daniel's mind raced with plans, strategies, possibilities. The flash drive was proof. The evidence could no longer be hidden. The house, once a place of memory and childhood comfort, now felt like a war room. A place where he had to gather the facts, prepare for confrontation, and reclaim the truth. As the first light of dawn crept through the study windows, Daniel finally leaned back, exhaustion and determination mixing in equal measure. He whispered to the empty room, to his father, to himself, "This ends soon. Michael can't hide anymore. I'll see justice. I'll make sure of it." And for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the full weight of clarity. The doubt was gone. The truth had revealed itself, raw and undeniable. Have you ever uncovered a truth so terrible it changed everything you thought you knew about your family? Daniel stood outside Michael's office, the polished glass reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the corporate hallway. He could hear the distant hum of printers and the low murmur of employees moving about, unaware of the storm about to erupt in their midst. When Michael looked up from his desk, he didn't even pretend surprise. His expression was one of mild amusement, almost boredom. "Danny," Michael said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "What a surprise. Come to join me for coffee." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He stepped forward, placing the envelope, the flash drive, and a few printed documents onto Michael's desk. Michael leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the papers, a small, mocking smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ah," he said, feigning recognition. "You found some old toys. Planning to play detective again." Daniel's hands shook slightly, but his voice was steady. "This isn't a game, Michael. I know what you did to Mom. I know what you've been doing with the company. The lies. The theft. The everything." Michael laughed, a low, cold sound. He leaned back further, placing his hands behind his head. "You were always the weak one, Danny. Do you really think the truth changes anything? She was gone long before that night. You think any of this matters?" The words cut through Daniel like a knife. He felt the old familiar pang of inadequacy, the one that had haunted him all his life. For years he had been told he was less capable, less strong, less worthy. Michael's voice brought all of that back, sharp and precise, aimed to wound. But this time something inside Daniel had shifted. The fear, the hesitation, the self-doubt that had plagued him for decades, it was gone. Michael smirked, confident, certain that Daniel would crumble under the weight of guilt and memory, certain that he would stay silent, just like always. He was wrong. Daniel spent the following nights planning. He sat in the quiet of his father's old study, surrounded by documents, letters, and recordings. Every forged contract, every stolen check, every manipulated ledger was cataloged. Every audio file, every voicemail, every hidden recording was backed up, printed, and labeled meticulously. He thought about his mother, the way she had trusted both of them, the way Michael had controlled her, isolated her, and finally betrayed her in the most final, irreversible way. He thought of the empty urn, the crematorium visit, the cold, rehearsed memorial. And he realized that this was no longer about revenge. Revenge was fleeting. It satisfied the ego but left scars. This was about justice, the kind his father had warned him to protect, the kind his mother had deserved. Daniel asked himself questions he knew the audience might relate to, questions that had been burning in his chest for weeks. Have you ever stayed silent because you thought speaking up wouldn't matter? Have you ever felt powerless while someone else controlled the truth, even within your own family? When the moment comes, will you act for justice, or will you let fear decide for you? Each night, he rehearsed the confrontation in his mind, not shouting, not losing control. Every word measured, every document positioned to reveal the truth in a way that couldn't be denied. The more he prepared, the more he felt the old doubts and guilt fade. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about righting the wrongs that had been done, about exposing Michael for what he really was. Finally, the day came. Daniel returned to the office, calm, determined, carrying only what he needed: the evidence, the documents, the recordings. Michael looked up, smug as ever. "I see you're back," Michael said, smirking. "Didn't expect you to have the courage." Daniel placed the folder on Michael's desk, then leaned against the edge, steady and unflinching. "This isn't about courage. It's about the truth. And the truth is undeniable." Michael's smirk faltered for a moment as he glanced at the documents. For the first time in decades, Daniel saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his brother's face. Tiny, fleeting, but unmistakable. "I have everything," Daniel continued. "Every forged check, every altered contract, every lie you've ever spun to manipulate this family and this company. And now everyone will see it. This ends today." Michael's posture stiffened. The casual mockery vanished, replaced by a flicker of calculation. But Daniel didn't flinch. He had rehearsed this moment, envisioned it, and he held the moral high ground. For hours they went back and forth. Michael tried to charm, to intimidate, to twist, but Daniel countered with evidence, with proof, with cold, unassailable facts. By the end of the confrontation, Michael had no more words. His confident, rehearsed control had crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. Daniel left the office that night with a calm he hadn't felt in years. The fight wasn't over. There were legal steps, disclosures, and conversations that still needed to happen, but he had crossed the threshold. He whispered to himself, almost like a vow. "This is justice, not revenge. Mom deserves it. Dad demanded it. And I won't stop until it's done." If you had irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing in your family, would you confront it head-on, or would you hesitate? The weeks that followed Daniel's confrontation were tense, deliberate, and calculated. He moved quietly but with purpose, aware that any misstep could allow Michael to cover his tracks, manipulate the narrative, or intimidate witnesses. Every email, every recording, every signed document was carefully copied, cataloged, and sent to the proper channels: the authorities, the company board, and select journalists with impeccable reputations. Daniel didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. He simply let the truth speak for itself. And speak it did. Within days, the first tremors appeared. Frozen bank accounts. Suspicious transactions flagged and halted. Letters of inquiry from the police began to arrive at the office. Shareholders demanded immediate explanations. The media, once silent, picked up whispers of discrepancies, and soon the story grew louder. Michael, confident and unshakable for decades, began to show cracks. His usual composure faltered in meetings. Emails went unanswered. Staff whispered behind closed doors. Rumors, once impossible to believe, now carried the weight of evidence. Then the footage surfaced anonymously, the video of that fateful night, the argument, the fall, the betrayal. It spread quietly at first, only among law enforcement and investigative journalists, but eventually it could not be contained. The truth was too clear, too damning. Arrest warrants followed. Fraud charges. Manslaughter. Manipulation. Forgery. Every accusation Daniel had documented, every secret he had unearthed, began to take form in reality. Daniel did not attend the court hearings. He did not need to. He had already won the battle that mattered most, the moral, undeniable truth of his mother's death, and the exposure of Michael's long, calculated deception. He watched from a distance, carefully avoiding public attention. The media buzzed, the legal machinery moved, and Michael's carefully constructed empire of lies began to crumble. And in the midst of it all, Daniel felt something strange: silence. Not the kind of peace one reads about in books or sees in movies. Not the relief that comes from the end of conflict. No, it was something quieter, subtler. The absence of fear. For the first time in decades, he did not feel the weight of intimidation, the creeping dread of manipulation, the suffocating control of someone who had always dominated him. He returned home one evening, the house feeling strange without the constant tension that Michael's presence had once imposed. The shadows seemed softer, the air lighter. And as he passed the drawer in the study, the one where he had found his father's warnings, the flash drive, the envelope, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked neatly between old receipts. It was a letter from his mother, written just days before her death. The handwriting was delicate, familiar, trembling slightly with age or perhaps illness, but unmistakably Eleanor's. Daniel unfolded it carefully, hands steady but heart racing. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made his chest ache. He fooled everyone but not you. Be at peace, my son. Tears blurred his vision, but they were not tears of fear or grief. They were tears of release, of validation, of quiet triumph over years of manipulation, deception, and control. Daniel sat in the old armchair, letter in hand, and let the silence settle over him. He thought of everything he had endured, the funeral and the warning, the cracks beneath the calm, the envelope and the flash drive, his mother's growing distance and eventual death, the secret footage, the confrontation with Michael. Each step had been painful, each revelation a blow, but now the chain of lies had been broken. The family he had inherited, one fractured by greed, manipulation, and fear, was no longer under Michael's shadow. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to imagine his mother alive again, smiling at him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He could almost hear her voice. You did what was right, Daniel. You protected what mattered most. And in that imagined moment, he finally felt the quiet peace he had long sought. It wasn't the restoration of the past, nor the undoing of loss. It was the knowledge that truth had prevailed, that justice had been done, and that he had honored both his father's warning and his mother's trust. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer. He did not need to read it again. Its words were etched into his memory, a final confirmation of his journey. Outside, the evening sky turned soft hues of orange and pink, the first signs of twilight. The house, once filled with tension, whispers, and fear, now seemed to breathe, as if it too had been relieved of Michael's oppressive presence. Daniel leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in decades, felt the world tilt not with fear or dread, but with quiet resolution. He had won more than a legal battle. He had reclaimed his family, preserved his mother's dignity, and honored his father's wisdom. And finally, Daniel was at peace. Have you ever witnessed someone's hidden deeds finally catching up to them? The first light of morning filtered softly through the clouds as Daniel stepped into the quiet cemetery. The soil was damp beneath his feet, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. Ahead, the familiar oak tree stood tall, its branches wide and comforting, the very tree where his mother had spent so many afternoons, reading quietly, lost in thought, basking in the sun. In his hands, Daniel carried the urn provided by the coroner, the real remains of Eleanor Mason. Not the empty, false vessel Michael had handed him months ago, but the truth. Finally, he would give his mother the dignity she deserved. He knelt beside his father's grave first, tracing the inscription with his fingertips, Jonathan Mason, beloved husband and father. Dad, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I see it now. I understand. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. Then he turned toward the oak tree, toward the spot prepared for his mother. He lowered the urn carefully, letting the ashes fall into the earth with deliberate reverence. Each grain was a promise kept, a story restored, a life finally honored. You're home now, Mom, Daniel said softly, his voice trembling with both grief and relief. For a long moment he remained kneeling there, feeling the weight of the past months, the betrayal, the lies, the secrecy, settle into a quiet stillness. Memories came rushing back. His father's warnings, the funeral, the confrontation, the flash drive, the secret footage. Every step had been painful, every revelation a blow. But now the chain of deception had been broken, and Daniel felt something he hadn't in years: peace. He thought of Michael. Forgiveness didn't come easily, not fully. Some wounds ran too deep, some betrayals too calculated. But he stopped letting Michael's presence live rent-free in his mind. Michael's control had ended. The lies had been exposed. Justice finally had been done. The old family home, once a place of memories and shadows, was sold quietly. Daniel packed his few belongings and walked away, leaving the past behind without sentimentality. The road ahead stretched open, wide and free, and for the first time, he felt the lightness of moving forward. Daniel reflected on the lessons learned, truths he now carried deeply. His father's warning was not about distrust, but about preparation, a guide to navigating deception and protecting himself. Family is more than blood. It's trust, honesty, and integrity. And sometimes the truth burns hotter than betrayal ever could. But it purifies, it frees, and it restores dignity. Standing beneath the oak tree, Daniel whispered a final vow, not to anyone else but to himself. I will live honestly. I will honor the truth. And I will never let betrayal define me again. The sun rose higher, spilling golden light over the graves, soft and warm. Daniel turned and walked away slowly, each step lighter than the last. It was not revenge that freed him, but honesty. Not anger, but the clarity of truth. And now, as you listen to this story, I want you to think for a moment. What truth in your own life have you been ignoring? Who in your world deserves honesty, respect, or closure? Don't wait. Don't let fear hold you back. Take the step today to protect the truth, honor your loved ones, and live with integrity. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of truth over betrayal, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the strength of courage, justice, and family. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand for what's right, even when it's hard.